This is our sixth parable through the book of Luke. Last time we looked at the parable of the invited guest and saw how mission is so important to God that He would send us out of our comfort zone in order to accomplish His plans. We should be prepared. Today, we will look at Luke chapter 15 from verses 8 to 10, the lost coin. It is a part of a set of four parables that includes the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the prodigal son, and the parable of the dishonest manager. We'll focus on the lost coin today. The parable is fairly straightforward. A woman lost a silver coin, made a considerable effort to look for it, and celebrated afterwards when she had found it. The only context that we need, perhaps, is the value of the coin. One coin is worth about a day's pay, so we use the minimum wage of Hong Kong as a reference. Let's say it's about $500. I think most of us would look for a $500 bill if we had lost it. It's something that we can relate to. So what's the point of the parable if it's something that anyone would do? Now, to appreciate that, we need to revisit the setting, which is from earlier in the chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So as it happened, the parable was told in response to an accusation from the Pharisees. Some of you know quite a bit about the Pharisees, but even if you don't, just from our series in Luke alone, you would have observed that they were a religious ruling council who didn't like Jesus and would use any opportunity to attack him. This particular attack today had nothing to do with Jesus' claim as Son of God. It was, in fact, a very short-sighted slur, something that they should not have done, even if they wanted to defame Jesus. The reason the Pharisees called the tax collectors sinners was that they were contractors of the Romans. The Romans used Jews to collect taxes from their fellow Jews in order to avoid cultural conflicts. So while it served its functions, the tax-collecting Jews became branded as cultural betrayers or even traitors. Now, on that alone, it seemed to make sense that the Pharisees would slur them. But it was not. The Pharisees, as a buffer class that ruled as religious leaders between the Romans and the Jews, were also indirectly Roman contractors. The only difference between them and the tax collectors were their instruments. The tax collectors ruled with monetary authority, while the Pharisees ruled with religious authority, both granted by the Romans. So it really was short-sighted of the Pharisees to call the tax collectors sinners, because such accusations could backfire on them culturally and politically. It could have caused them real trouble with the Romans. But such is the nature of human hypocrisies, something we all stand guilty of. Given such a setting, Jesus' parable wasn't necessarily a defense of why he would eat with tax collectors. It might have been, but it's just as possible that he was just using that as an occasion to teach his disciples instead. Either way, what's Jesus' main point? What's very apparent is that Jesus was talking about numbers, and by extension, proportions and priorities. There's nothing fancy about that, right? 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100 is a set of numbers, and the point is their proportion and the implied priority. What's also very clear is that the 1, whether out of 100 or out of 10, is an analogy for a person. And what kind of a person? A sinner, right? A sinner. A lost son a lost sheep, or a lost coin are all analogies for a sinner. So in that context, just what did Jesus teach? Since this is a short passage, I have a small luxury with time. So instead of getting to Jesus' lesson directly, let's revisit two biblical events. Events that everyone around Jesus knew. The first event was the flood, as recorded in Genesis 6-9. And a very condensed version would be that the human race became corrupted, both through demonic infiltration and their own willful sinning. So God sent the flood. The entire human race was destroyed. Only Noah and his family were saved. The second event was the aftermath of the golden calf in Exodus 32. After Israel sinned against God by worshipping the golden calf, God told Moses that he would destroy everyone involved and start anew with Moses' descendants. Then Moses pleaded and God relented. Both are well-known biblical events. Many of you know them well, and likewise the Jews back in the days of Jesus. Both stories tell of a similar theme. When sin is present, God has and can wipe out sin in a wholesale manner. Wholesale, collective, en bloc, whatever term you prefer. The idea is the same. God can and has wiped out 100%. God can wipe out and would be entirely just and righteous for him to do so. The Jews remember that, and we would be wise to be mindful of the same. So that's the first point to note about God's sense of proportion. He is willing to wipe out 100% in order to preserve his holiness. God is willing to wipe out 100% in order to preserve his holiness. Unless we think that God is brutal, hold that thought. We'll come back to the idea of God's brutality later in the message. Coming back to Jesus, he's now presenting a completely different perspective. He said that a shepherd would look for one sheep out of 100, or a woman would look for one coin out of 10, implying that sinners, however small in proportion, is worth Jesus' while to save. What Jesus presented here is the contrast between law and grace. The law, which the Pharisees held near and dear, is powerful. It describes the righteousness of God and the holiness he desires for his children. Could we live up to it? Supposedly, yes. Supposedly, yes. We sin because we choose to sin. But that point is moot, because left to our own device, we would just sin and fail the law repeatedly. And the consequence of that is the destruction of the human race. Can God do that? Yes, he can. We just saw two examples. Would God do that? Yes, too, but not until he has saved everyone he's planned to save. Thus view, today's parable is actually not about how many, but also how God plans to save. Before getting to how, let's quickly look at how many. Jesus came to save sinners. Lots and lots of sinners. Since it is Jesus who saves, we have to look at sinners from his perspective, or at least from his perspective, the best we know how. Sinners are not naughty children per se. We all have naughty children in our lives, and while their mischiefs upset or even infuriates us, we are able to look past that and love them no less. And since the children narrative is sometimes loosely tied to us being God's children and how he loves us, that naughty children analogy becomes commonplace. though it can be very misleading. We just saw that God would and could wipe out all sinners. In other words, sinners are not naughty children in that sense at all. They, or we are in fact God's enemy. We are not God's naughty children. Absolutely not. We are His enemy. We are God's enemy, and Jesus decided to save us. Whether that is 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100. Jesus came to save the enemies of His Father. And of course, it's not like God and Jesus were working against each other. As John 10:30 tells us, I and the Father are one, right? God and Jesus, they have a perfect unity. So the reason Jesus came to save is because God doesn't want to destroy. He would rather save, but His justice demands destruction. So He sent His Son to be His grace personified. And this answers the earlier point about God's brutality, that He would wipe out people in order to preserve holiness. Make no mistake, God always wipes out unholiness because His world cannot be anything less than perfectly holy. So given the scale of unholiness is identical to the size of the human race, because we are all sinners, either the world is wiped out, or as in the days of Noah, or something equivalent has to happen. Either the world is wiped out, just like He did with Noah's days, or something equivalent. And that's the grace versus law contrast that Jesus presented. Jesus Himself is the equivalent. He took on the sins of the world, past and future. And with that, He bore the full wrath of God's justice. The key word here being full wrath. The entirety of God's anger. Jesus bore it all. Ever considered what was happening between God and Jesus at the cross? At the point when Jesus died? I mean, our Easter messages has made much of Jesus' perspective. His pain, His suffering, and His death. Ever consider God's perspective? Now, while we can never fully comprehend God, the Bible has made two things clear. The wrath of God and the heart of God. God was so angry with sin that He had to deal with it. The scale of that anger, the scale of God's anger, is powerful enough to kill the Son of God. Do consider this. How else could the Son of God die? It takes the full wrath of God to kill the Son of God. And yet, at the same time, the heart of God must be bleeding. We just read that the Father and the Son are one. So as the Son died on the cross, bearing the sins of humankind, the Father must have been equally brokenhearted. For one moment, the only moment in the history of the universe, Father and Son were separated, so sin could be destroyed without having to wipe out the human race. And that is how many Jesus would save. Every lost sheep or lost coin is a sinner, and Jesus would save each whom the Father has sent Him to save. At the great pain and cost we just described. Which brings us to the last remaining question. How to find that lost coin or lost sheep? Before getting to how, let's think about where. A coin is a good illustration because we have all lost something at home. If we have lost something outside, they might be lost forever. But something lost at home can be found. But where are they? We don't lose things on top of a table. If they're lost, they're probably behind a sofa or under a bed. So we'll have to bend down, crawl to look for them, and when found, they're probably dirty, dusty, in need of some cleaning. And that's how sinners are found. It is an awkward, tiring, and uncertain process. And it needs to be done one at a time. Awkward, tiring, one at a time. That's how Jesus saves, and by extension, that's what we should expect when we join his mission. We don't have to look far for examples. Think about ourselves. Jesus used a Bob or a Jane who worked on our lives even though it was awkward and tiring. And let's be honest, we weren't that lovable, right? Yet they worked for our souls to present us as a lost coin before Jesus because they love Jesus and they love us. And that's how we were found. We mustn't lose sight of that. Now what about us? We all have a few lost coins in our lives. And if we were to go looking, we would find more too. Would we? Do we look forward to counting those lost coins when we meet Jesus face to face? Do we want to see Jesus, hey, thank you, that you enabled me to find these lost coins? That's the heart of Jesus. And that's the main idea today. Let me end with a little story. So my wife Jo had a nanny when she was a kid. And the nanny retired when Jo left home for secondary school and university. They've kept in touch over the years, and when we got married, visiting her during Spring Festival was a regular event. One year, we found that she was no longer in her flat. And through her neighbor, we learned that she was in hospital. With some help from my sister Elaine, who was working at Tuen Mun Hospital at the time, we located her. She had taken a fall, and for old people, that often meant quick deterioration. We decided to visit her more, up to a few times a week. Miraculously, she recovered and was relocated to an old age home. We visited her there and took her out each week to do physiotherapy. And this must have gone on for 2 to 3 years. So we got to spend tens of hours with her. And she was also in and out of hospital during that time. So Elaine came along too, bringing her fruits, etc. We loved on her as a family. We also shared the good news of Jesus with her. And by grace, she accepted him. And we know that her faith was genuine because she voluntarily said to us that she no longer feared death, knowing that she will be reunited with the Lord. 3 years after her fall, she died peacefully. At her cremation, we talked to her neighbor, and whom we got to know over the years. And we told her that Nanny is now with Jesus and asked if she would accept him too. And she did. So through this, Jesus showed Jo, Elaine, and me how he could find 2 lost coins from deathbeds, from elderly home, at cremation ceremony. Nothing extraordinary, but hardly common either. God gave us the strength to do something a little awkward, a little tiring, getting our fingers a little dirty, so 2 lost coins could be found. And verse 10 reads, "In the same way, I tell you, there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." Do we want more of these celebrations? We need more. So let me sum up. The story began with the pretext that God could and has wiped out humankind for the sake of holiness. That's how precious holiness is. Yet for the sake of sinners, like lost and dirty coins, he would rather lay all his wrath on his Son instead of us, so we could become found. Finding a lost coin is often awkward and frankly unwelcomed, except that that's just how we were found, and that's how our children are going to be found, and their children. Jesus did it for us, and he expects us to do the same for his kingdom. The point of all this is not to pressure or oblige anyone into mission. The heavenly celebration over every lost coin reminds us that finding the lost is immeasurably joyful. We should all be motivated. To close, may I encourage us all to pray for a lost coin. Not someone we are already praying for, but to add someone new to that list. Pray every day. Pray for their lives. Pray for our strength to get awkward, get tired, even get dirty, so they could be found. Keep praying until they are found. God will show us how. God bless.